Have you ever glanced into the cockpit on your way to your seat and just felt like you were looking at a completely different world? It's not just all the buttons and switches, it's what the pilots know. Today, we're going to pull back that curtain on the massive library of invisible knowledge that separates a passenger from a pilot. So let's just ask it straight up. What is the real difference between the person sitting in the pilot's seat and the person back in row 23? It's not the uniform. It's not just the skill to move the controls. The real difference is something you can't even see. And here it is. It's a massive, invisible library of information they carry around in their heads. See, flying isn't just a physical act. It's a mental game. It is a constant, never-ending process of checks, cross-checks, and decisions. It's about knowing exactly what to do long before you ever have to do it. And that whole process, that whole mental game, it starts way, way before takeoff. A pilot's first flight of the day really happens on the ground, navigating this whole world of regulations and checks for themselves, for their plane, and for all the paperwork that proves everything is safe and legal. You know, what's so cool about this is that it shows the journey. When you're a student pilot, you're in a pretty tight leash. You can't carry passengers, you definitely can't fly for money. But the second you earn that private pilot license, boom, a whole new world opens up. You can take your friends for a ride, fly for charity events, as long as you chip in for your share of the costs. It's a huge jump in freedom, but also in responsibility. So what does a pilot have to carry on them? I mean, personally, in their wallet. It's these three things every single time. It's kind of like your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. They need their pilot certificate, a valid medical certificate that proves they're physically fit to fly, and a government ID. If they're missing even one of those, they're not legally allowed to be the pilot in command. Okay, so that's the pilot. What about the plane? Well, before every flight, the pilot has to determine that the aircraft is airworthy. And that's not some one-time stamp of approval. It's a continuous state of being. The plane has to be in good mechanical shape, and all its inspections have to be up to date. And here's the kicker. The final call, the final responsibility for making sure it's airworthy, that rests on the pilot's shoulders before every single flight. So how in the world do they remember all the required documents that have to be physically inside the airplane? Well, they use a handy little mnemonic, AIRO. You've got A for the Airworthiness Certificate, R for the plane's registration. The second R is for a radio license, but that's mainly for international flights. O is for the operating limitations, that's basically the plane's owner's manual. And W is for weight and balance data, which is absolutely critical for a safe flight. And if that wasn't enough, there's another checklist just for the plane's maintenance schedule. They remember this one with the mnemonic AV8s. Think of this like the plane's legally required health checkup. It includes the annual inspection, a VOR check for navigation equipment, a 100-hour inspection if the plane is being used for hire, and checks every 2 years for the altimeter and transponder. It's a super rigorous schedule to keep the plane safe. Okay, so the pilot is ready, the plane is ready. But, right, they don't fly in a bubble. Now we get to the next massive challenge, reading the environment. Pilots have to be part amateur meteorologist and part expert navigator of highways that are completely invisible. One of the very first things a pilot learns is how to read the air itself. Is it stable or is it unstable? Stable air, that usually means a nice smooth ride. But you might get hazy, poor visibility with those flat, layered stratiform clouds. Unstable air, on the other hand, that'll give you fantastic visibility and those big, puffy, cotton ball-like cumuliform clouds. But it's also where you find turbulence and sudden showers. A pilot literally looks at the sky and sees a forecast for the kind of ride they're about to have. And what's the ultimate example of unstable air? Yep, a thunderstorm. Pilots have a profound respect for these things because they know exactly how they work. It all starts with the cumulus, or building stage. Then it hits the mature stage. This is the most dangerous part, with violent winds going both up and down. And finally, it weakens in the dissipating stage. The rule for pilots is simple. Stay far, far away from them. So you can see the weather more or less, but what about the route itself? I mean, there are no road signs up there at 10,000 feet. How do pilots know where they're allowed to fly and where they're not? They do it by navigating something called the National Airspace System, which is basically broken up into different classes. The absolute best way to think about this is like roads on the ground. Class B airspace is like a massive superhighway around a huge international airport. You need explicit one-on-one permission from air traffic control to even think about entering. Class C and D are more like the highways and local roads around smaller cities and towns where you just need to make radio contact before you enter. All right, we are finally off the ground and in the air. So now let's go inside the cockpit, where a pilot is constantly managing the physics of flight, staying prepared for things to go wrong, and, this is the wild part, understanding all the ways their own body can lie to them. At its very core, flight is a beautiful balancing act between these four forces. You have thrust from the engine pushing forward, fighting against drag pulling backward. And you have lift from the wings pulling up, fighting against the plane's weight pulling down. When a plane's just cruising along, all those forces are in perfect equilibrium. Every single maneuver a pilot makes is about gently manipulating that balance. But what happens when things are not so balanced? What if a gauge on the instrument panel just goes dark, mid-flight? Does the pilot have to panic and land immediately? Well, not necessarily. And this is where another one of those wild mnemonics comes in. Tomato flames. This spells out the absolute bare minimum equipment you need for a safe flight during the day. It covers the basics, right? Like an altimeter, an airspeed indicator, a fuel gauge, a compass. So if an instrument that's not on this list fails, a pilot can often just deactivate it, label it inoperative, and safely continue the flight. It's a pretty cool system. Now this might be the single most fascinating and frankly kind of scary part of a pilot's knowledge. Up in the air, especially when you can't see the ground clearly, your own senses, the very things you trust every second of every day, can become your worst enemy. These sensory illusions are so common that, you guessed it, they have their own mnemonic, ice flags. For instance, there's one called the leans, where a pilot might feel like they're banking when their wings are perfectly level. Or a false horizon, which can trick a pilot into lining up with a slanted cloud deck instead of the real horizon. And then there's the graveyard spiral, a truly deadly illusion where a pilot, losing the sensation of turning, might pull back on the yoke, which only tightens the turn until it's too late. This is why the #1 rule of flying in the clouds is drilled into every pilot. Trust your instruments, not your feelings. And that brings us to our last section, and really the most important piece of this whole puzzle. We've talked about instruments and gauges, but the single most critical tool in any cockpit is the pilot's own well-trained mind. It's a formal process called aeronautical decision-making, or ADM. It's not just good judgment, it's a structured, systematic way of thinking, a mental checklist for managing risk and stress. It's the framework that helps a pilot process everything, the plane, the weather, the route themselves, and consistently make the safest possible choice. And a huge piece of ADM is learning to recognize these dangerous mindsets in yourself. Pilots are literally trained to spot these 5 hazardous attitudes. But what's so brilliant is that for each bad attitude, they're taught a specific mental antidote to counter it. So if a pilot catches themselves thinking, it won't happen to me, that's invulnerability. The trained response is to immediately say to themselves, no, it could happen to me. It's an amazing tool for real-time, in-your-head self-correction. And that self-check comes full circle, right back to where we started. We've checked the pilot's documents, we've checked the plane's documents and its health, but the final check is on the pilot themselves. And for that, there's one last mnemonic, IMS-AFE. It's a personal checklist to make sure they aren't dealing with any illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, or emotion. It's the last go, no-go decision before a flight. So, from all the paperwork on the ground to the weird illusions in the clouds, that invisible library of knowledge is all dedicated to one thing, making safe decisions. We all think of flying as this symbol of ultimate freedom, but what pilots know is that true skill isn't just about knowing how to fly the machine, it's about knowing how to carry the immense, unwavering weight of responsibility that comes with that freedom.